At this point, I've been asked to introduce the panelists and moderator for the first session, Science Journalism's Brave New World. I'd like to invite them to step forward and take their seats on the stage, please. We're immensely fortunate to welcome such a talented group this afternoon. As they take their seats, I will do my best to introduce them. Let's hope we have enough seats for everyone.
You may want the moderator up there, right?
You're okay for
okay
now, I think. And let me start with this afternoon's moderator. They will acknowledge themselves as I introduce each and every one of them. Irene Maher's career in media and broadcasting spans almost 30 years and includes stints in radio, TV, and newspaper writing. She has worked as a health reporter at WFLA-TV in Tampa, a weekly columnist for the Tampa Tribune, host of Florida Matters on WUSF-TV, and currently serves as a health news writer for the St. Petersburg Times. Irene, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, panelists this afternoon include, and I'll start with Elie Dolgin, PhD, who is a science journalist and news editor for Nature Medicine, and has worked as a biomedical reporter with Nature and as an associate editor for The Scientist. His work has appeared in Science, New Scientist, Scientific American Lives, The Globe and Mail, as well as many other publications. Elie, welcome.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Sheril, who is a research scientist at the University of Texas at Austin, a writer for the science column at Bloomberg View, host of the blog Culture of Science, and her writing has appeared in several publications and journals. She is author of The Science of Kissing and co-author of Unscientific America, How Scientific Illiteracy Threatens Our Future. Sheril, welcome. Claudia Dreifus writes for the New York Times Science Times, where she is known for her unusual interviews with scientists, policymakers, and international figures. She is an author, interviewer, and an adjunct professor at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. Welcome. And rounding out this afternoon's first panel is Charlotte Sutton. Charlotte is the health and medicine editor at the St. Petersburg Times, where she leads a team of 3 reporters responsible for medical news in the daily paper, on the TampaBay.com website, and in the twice-monthly personal health section she created. Charlotte has been a reporter and editor in Florida for 25 years. So again, please welcome all of our panelists. And Irene, I'm happy to pass over to you.
Thank you. I can hear the microphone is working. Everyone have their microphone on? We're all good? For the record, let me just say that everyone on this stage is in fact a journalist. So that when you get the call from Research America with the survey question about naming a journalist, you now know 4, and they're not on TV. Let's start with the changing face of the newsroom. Reporters are, as I think all of us have noticed, you may not know this, but reporters are rarely experts in their beat anymore. You are assigned to a story a lot of times just sort of randomly, or maybe based on what part of town you're working in that particular day. We're covering long lists of stories these days, more likely than just one story, on a range of topics that, again, may not have to do with the beat that you started out with or really enjoy covering. Our task list now also includes writing for the website, posting something on Facebook, entering something on your blog, and don't forget to tweet about it a couple of times during the day, and on weekends, if you can, by any means. How are we as journalists to balance all of this, and what effect does this have on our readers and our audiences? That's my first question. Charlotte, would you care to begin?
Well, I don't think this is on.
Get your little box, and there's a little switch.
It's on. It's on.
You're good.
Oh, can you hear it?
Mm-hmm.
I can hear myself. Well, the question that you're asking really poses a lot of challenges for all of us. And since I think in this room, we're talking about a lot of scientists and how scientists can work more effectively with journalists, I'd sort of like to focus there. I think most of the folks on this panel actually do have some expertise in the areas in which we're working. But Irene's right. I mean, on any given moment, any one of you in the sciences could get a phone call from somebody who last week was writing about an axe murderer and the week before was, writing a nice fluffy feature story. You just don't know what you're going to get. So it is really, really critical that your partnership, with a journalist, you have a conversation and you try to ascertain, well, what is the level of expertise that you're dealing with here? And it's also really important for journalists to be very frank with scientists. I mean, I think that I'm always telling young reporters, don't be shy to say that you don't know anything. You've just got to start out that way and allow yourself to be educated every day. I think on the flip side, with the advent of online journalism, we are seeing more people who are specialists in what they're doing. So I think that is going to bode well for research news in the future. But it really is, I can't emphasize this enough, how important it is for scientists and journalists to work together and try to meet each other's needs as best they can.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Claudia?
Well, I think it's the best of times and the worst of times for science journalism. The good news is that I think, as we saw from Mary's report, the benefits of science and technology are ever more apparent to the public. Just think of it, AIDS therapies, Lipitor, Viagra, iPhones. If you need proof of this, just consider the Diana-like mass behavior at Steve Jobs' death, which I've never seen for a scientific figure in my life. Not Thomas Edison. Did Thomas Edison get such a send-off? But the bad news is that science sections are disappearing from newspapers. I work at the last freestanding science section, maybe in the country. A couple of years ago, and I think Sheril was there, I was asked to present the prize at the Kavli Science Journalism Awards. 3 of the 6 prize winners were unemployed. The very publications that they had worked for and won the prizes for had gone out of business in that 6 months period. That's scary. Then there's the aspect of the internet, which is, again, an area Sheril has pioneered. It's a source of tremendous good. It makes science information available to the public in a way as it's never been before. Tell me when I start filibustering, because I can go on. I feel passionate about this. So it makes, for instance, my students at Columbia can publish at a very early stage about science, which they could not 10 years ago, thanks to the internet. They can't make a living at it, but they can publish. On the other hand, the internet provides an enormous vehicle for disinformation about science, because any nutty thing has the same weight as the New York Times. It flattens everything. So think about Thermacell. On one hand, people have the capacity now to get diagnosed and look up what's wrong, and go to their doctors with good information. At the same time, it gets into the zeitgeist that thimerosal causes autism, and suddenly kids are not getting vaccinated. Or how would Africa look if Thabo Mbeki hadn't stayed up late at night looking at his internet connections and decided that AIDS was just a capitalistic hoax and it wasn't caused by a virus? That's the downside. And then there's the third factor, and that's why we're here talking with you, which I have to say honestly, scientists are not good at communicating with the press. That's got to get fixed, because you cannot tell your story unless you find ways to do that. I don't want to take up too much time, but one of the ways I try to help is I teach a course for scientists on how to write, sort of English as a second language for people with PhDs. Because the language that all of you work in is not particularly communicative. Plus, add to it that you work in universities where even the English departments don't know how to communicate. So you're working with very, very, there are a lot of strikes against you for reaching out and moving into this brave new world that is open and accessible. I'll talk more on that later. Let me know how it is.
Elie, would you like to just tell us your views of how the newsroom has changed and changed the way you report, perhaps?
Sure. I guess I have a little bit of a different perspective working for a scientific publication, or specifically a journal. Although I did also intern once at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel the summer where every single newspaper cut 10% of its staff. So I've seen
my goodness.
The scariness as well. But I mean, one of the things that I think, there's this perpetual thing about how scientists and journalists need to work together better and how do we find that common ground. And I thought there was an interesting kind of Twitter and blog thread that I suggest people check out that stemmed last month because of a kind of a panel like this that happened at a meeting in Chicago in September about, I think it was the Society for Antimicrobial Agents meeting or something like that, where the reporter for the Chicago Tribune was asked a pretty innocuous question, but it kind of created this storm, and it was, how do you check your sources afterwards? And this kind of goes to the heart of how that relationship between the journalist and their source, and the scientist in this case. And it set off this firestorm about whether journalists should let sources see their text, how to fact check, how to quote check, how to do this whole thing. And it was interesting because nobody could agree on that. Some scientists felt that they had sort of a right to how their message got out there and felt that, and I talk to journalists and often they, will insist on that, and you have to kind of explain that's not really how it works, because on the one hand, our role as science journalists is to communicate science and raise the science literacy and put science into the public message, but also we're not soapboxes and we're not press officers. I mean, and there's also sort of a watchdog role, a bulldog reporting type role. And so as we explore this today, kind of, I want to sort of raise that idea that, that relationship, although we do want to work together, there's how cozy do we want to be? How do we get that right thing where as journalists we're independent and as scientists you're getting your research out there, your message out there, and how to work together. And if for anyone who's interested in that, I do recommend checking out this blog thread that raised quite a storm.
I wonder, do you not do a story because it's too complex?
No.
You find a way to tell that story that appeals to your readers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The tricky part gets when is sort of getting, for journalism and for a simple message, you often need to have just that, a lead or a headline,
Mm-hmm.
and science is full of nuance and caveat and disclaimers and all that, and sometimes there isn't space to do both, and it's that responsibility of the enterprise to get that balance right, and that's what we struggle with every day.
Sheril, go ahead. How about your impressions?
Oh my goodness, there's so many points that have already come up that I'd love to address. But I guess I should start by saying I didn't come into science journalism in a traditional sense. I started in graduate school for marine biology, where I was studying the very majestic sea cucumber. And then I was fortunate enough by serendipity to get one of these science fellowships working on the Hill for your senator, Bill Nelson, who I think really, really does care about a lot of these issues tremendously. But I was increasingly frustrated because the folks who were coming to my office from the science community, for the most part, not universally, but I'd say 90% of the time, were coming about issues that I really cared about: climate change, teaching evolution in the classroom, all of these really, really big things, some of which would be coming up legislatively, but they were giving me p-values. They were showing me figures and graphs and charts, and I was pretty much the only science person in my office with that background that understood what they were trying to communicate with me. And I quickly learned that to get anything across to my boss, I really had to break it down, which is what came up in the introduction, to simply, what is it, why does it matter, and how does it affect my state, my constituency? You know, why should I care? In bullet points. And when you come from the academic community, you're used to this very stringent peer review process where everything happens very slowly and you have to get everything out there. But that's not how policy works. And so I became increasingly interested in being a better science communicator, and I left the very traditional pipeline and moved into journalism, but very much because of the new opportunities that new media has created, because I started blogging initially with Chris Mooney at The Intersection and now on my own at Culture of Science. But as Claudia was just saying, and rightly so, while it does afford this wonderful means to connect with the public, to connect with people on issues they might be interested in and not really, I mean, they don't have access to our journals, right? We have these very, very closed circles where people have to buy expensive subscriptions to actually read the studies. So instead, we're left with the internet, or as Jenny McCarthy calls the University of Google, where anyone can find, I mean, you can shop for your science information the same as you shop for your holiday presents. Anything you want to find, you can, and you'll find some expert purporting that it's true. And then I wanted to say, too, with regard to the leads, the headlines, I mean, that's something that's been very uncomfortable for me to get used to, because I do like the nuance. I do think a lot of these particulars about any research, any whatever it is, need to be outlined, need to be highlighted. And so moving into the field of journalism, when I've been working with editors, they're often kind of tweaking things, changing things, putting a headline out that I don't even agree with, and then you have to make the call, is this something I'm comfortable enough with to let it run with my name on it, because I think it's important information to get out there, or is this something I can't stand behind any longer? And then on top of that, I mean, the people on this panel are phenomenally good science journalists, but as much as scientists often are uncomfortable communicating with people who are telling these stories, I mean, there are some really lousy science journalists as well, and I've been on the other side of that, having my own research, and not only misreported, but seeing things that were simply made up by people who hadn't even spoken to me, but were creating quotes about what I did or what I said, and I mean, made my own stuff sound ridiculous. And so I think maybe my take-home message after all of this ranting on different subjects would be, I think it's really, really important, as Claudia and everyone has said, to create those important, strong relationships with journalists, but I think you have to be very careful about the people that you choose to speak with, making sure that they are, they are credible and they value what you have to say and they value your contribution. But again, they can't be going back and forth showing you a proof the way that we would in the science community, where of course it's an academic paper, you'd be going back and forth with all your co-authors, making sure everyone's okay with it. Whereas in journalism, you would never show that piece to the person you interviewed. And that, at least for me, took a long time to get used to, because everyone says, can you show it to me when you drafted it? And then I have to say, no, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that and address this question of how complex is science really to communicate. Some of it is very complex, and some of it is less complex than you would think. Einstein said something like, if you can't show it to your grandmother, if you can't explain it to your grandmother, don't explain it to me. And that's true. Lots of very difficult things can be boiled down to a level that you can explain to one's grandmother. Not everything, but many more things than people in science would accept. And I think part of the culture of academe functions, unfortunately, to make things seem sometimes more complex than they are. And that is something you guys have to deal with. It's not particularly valued to speak plainly, to speak simply. There's a lot of ornateness that is valued, bells and whistles added on. But to communicate with the public, you need to do that.
What do you think about media training for researchers?
Absolutely. May I just tell a story from this? An hour ago, I was sitting with some colleagues from Research America, and a gentleman came up to me and began talking about something on fluoridation he wanted to do. I'm not an editor. He wanted to do something local. I don't work for a local paper. He was not particularly interesting, and he went on, and I said, maybe you ought to stay for this session and see if you could get some ideas from him. And he said he couldn't, he had to get back to his lab. Well, that attitude is not a winning attitude. And there is a certain amount of that one encounters when dealing with scientists who often in their own work lives don't have to deal with others that much. They have their own labs, they're important people, what they say goes. But for the rest of the world, it isn't like that. So I think training is the answer.
Training is good.
If I could kind of add on to what you were saying, Claudia, most of my career has not been in health journalism. I've covered many, many different sorts of beats. And what's common to all of them is that people want to read a good story. Mm-hmm. And, you know, researchers have wonderful stories to tell if you kind of break it down and say, well, what is the story here? What's interesting to a normal person? Because, you know, in academia, you know, you've got a certain kind of competition, but if you're on the web or if you're in a general interest newspaper, or, you know, you are competing with a million different kinds of stories. And that's really the way that you have to think about it. I mean, we've got some, is Ann Beyer here? Hi, Ann. There she is. Ann works at USF in the Media Relations Department, and she is very talented at teasing those stories out of people. I think once, I hope I'm not getting confused here, I often do, but you know, one of the things that science journalists, I think, always kind of roll their eyes about is rat research. Because, you know, people get all excited because something worked in a rat. And it's like, that's it. Now we're curing cancer, we're curing Alzheimer's, it's all great. And so, you know, you always have to be very careful about these things. But, you know, if there's a wonderful story to be told, I mean, there was a researcher who was having these rats swim in the lab, and all of a sudden they did something really, really, you know, that nobody was expecting. It was synchronized swimming.
Yes.
It was Esther Williams. But in any event, it was just enough to make us say, well, that's kind of a cool little story. You know, what happened in the lab that day? And you know, you really have to think about it in different terms than you do in your academic journals.
Don't you almost become a partner, though, with that person? Is that getting too close, or are you being helpful? I wonder.
What do you mean in terms of?
When you're working with a researcher who you think may have a good story to tell, but it's just too up there. It's just not down to the viewer point of view yet. Can you work with them? Can you talk to them? Can you bring it out of them? Is that getting too close to the person? Or?
No, it's a story like any other. I also cover foreign affairs. That's the problem. People are treating science as if it's radioactive material. It is a story like any other. It is a human endeavor. Human beings do it. There's a narrative. There used to be a time in this culture when the stories of scientists were mass popular entertainment. I'm talking about the 1930s and a whole string of Warner Brothers movies. The story of Louis Pasteur, the story of Marie Curie. Dr. Vasso's Magic Bullet. People went to see these movies. Were they deep science? No, they had an arc, which usually ended in discovery or Marie Curie finding love, and theirs was a great marriage, let me tell you. But it was about people and discovery, and that could be done now.
Okay,
Elie? I just wanted to add that also the importance of storytelling is not just, explain things to the public, your mother, your grandmother, whomever. It's your peers too. As I said, I work in this trade publication, and our primary readership are scientists themselves. And they also like to hear stories about their colleagues. And one of the best compliments I ever got on a news feature that I wrote was someone said, it was like a review article, but it was fun to read.
That's
which
good.
was which was really nice in a way, saying, you covered the field really well, but I actually liked reading it as opposed to, whatever the latest dry review piece is. And so even if, and there's studies showing that papers that get more media coverage also get cited more, which says, I don't care about the media, but your colleagues are actually, that's a primary way that your colleagues are learning about your research as well.
And your university cares.
Yeah, your employer definitely cares, your grant agencies care and all that, but even on a very selfish perspective, it's a way to tell your story, to your colleagues, and I think that to be engaging and to have that storytelling mentality in the back of your head is really important.
Sheril, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just quickly, as far as media training for scientists, if the science community doesn't learn how to tell these stories, very often special interest groups with hidden agendas are going to be trying to tell those stories for us. And so it's critical that we get in there and use our voice. Now that said, in terms of what scientists can do, that's very challenging because for any working scientist, you're running a lab, you're teaching, you're advising, you're on committees, it goes on and on and on. So who wants some other responsibility to do at the end of the day? So I think we're not going to see a shift in attitudes on scientists getting more engaged until the system starts rewarding it. And right now, in many cases, they're not.
What about when information is released? We get a ton of emails all day long about this study and that study, and there were 10 people in the study, there were 20 people in this study. What about all of these that come through the pipeline? They're on Twitter, they're on Google, everywhere. How do you handle that?
Well, my inbox is junk because the universities have, and companies and research institutes have increased their public relations staffs massively. And so everything gets sent out all the time. And basically, I don't use that as my source almost at all because it doesn't seem to me credible. It seems to me like stuff is just getting sent out for the sake of getting it sent out so that somebody can report to their boss they've sent out press releases.
Right.
It's like huge amounts of white noise that you have to ignore. And it's increasing all the time. I don't find stories that way almost ever.
I think that's especially true when you get people who are trying to craft a message. Like maybe there will be some news story making this totally up, and then all of a sudden everybody's like, "Ooh, I have a connection to it. I have a connection to it," and they start angling it. If people would just look around and say, "Well, what are our scientists doing that is interesting in and of itself?" I think that might be more useful.
Every pancreatic cancer researcher in the world sent a press release out when Steve Jobs died.
Yeah, right. Everybody wanted to jump on that bandwagon.
Yeah, it's just not useful.
Right. How are we doing on time? It's about time to go to the questions and the answers in the audience. If you would like to ask a question of our panel, please approach one of the microphones and give us your name if you don't mind.
Good afternoon. My name is Dave Morgan. I'm at the Alzheimer's Institute here at USF. There's two things that I'd like, it's almost more of a comment, I think, than a question. but I've interacted with the press a fair amount. And there's two things that I found that make it challenging for scientists to do that. And there may be solutions and there may not. The first one there probably isn't, and that is scientific jealousy. Jim Watson once said, the more my name appears in the newspaper, the less my colleagues are willing to collaborate with me. And this is a very significant issue. One of the worst scientific breakups I've ever had was over the failure of one of my colleagues' names to appear in a newspaper article that I had talked to the reporter about. And I had actually given them that name, and it never showed up. Okay, so this is, and it's often the case that you see some major article written about something that you know in your field. This really isn't that big a deal. Why is that getting press and my very important research isn't? So this is a somewhat minor issue, but I think it's still something to consider. A second issue, and if any of you have the opportunity today to watch the rerun of last night's Daily Show, I don't know how many of you saw these, but it was absolutely astounding how Asif Mandi was interviewing at least some politically oriented person who was saying that essentially science is a giant fraud and it's self-perpetuating because the scientists come up with a finding and who verifies those findings? Well, other scientists. And all they're trying to do is get more money from the government. And so, of course, they support each other all the time, and it's all one big lie. Now, that's something where we need you to really help us in overcoming this attitude. And I don't think it's just Fox News that's doing this. I think it really does spread across a certain spectrum of both the political landscape and the human landscape.
So how we pick our stories and how we...
Well, let's say, for example, I guess the one that everybody has picked on is the global warming issue. Of how, 1 out of 1,000 groups that have been looking at global warming appears to have possibly fabricated their data. That somehow, in the newspapers, seems to discredit the entire concept that global warming is a significant issue. And I think it's important that the balance amongst those things be brought out. I know that the press has to be sensational to sell it. I understand that. And I see sometimes, however, that the claims that are made go way beyond what the data actually are. And I think that people can easily pick up on small pieces of that, and unless it's very carefully edited, we'll get the wrong impression. Okay? And that's just, those are my concerns.
Okay, thank you. Anybody, Sheril?
Well, I would say on your first point, with regard to scientists not being accepted within the community for being too much of a star, I mean, that's certainly true. I hope that that's changing. We saw that with people like Carl Sagan, who people criticized for going on the Johnny Carson show. And we still see that today. There are many examples, and I won't name names, of people who are suspected, very, very popular scientists, people who are great science communicators, not getting tenure, and it's whispered behind closed doors. They were spending too much time on television. They couldn't be serious researchers. But whatever the cause, I mean, I think that that's definitely true. Although I also feel like that's more of a traditional establishment perspective, and as younger people make their way up in academia, perhaps we'll see that change. With regard to climate or global warming, I mean, climate is a word we don't even hear in the current administration anymore because it's become such a politically charged word. But at least for my own writing, I find other ways to talk about it. I mean, maybe if you say climate, you're immediately having a political conversation, but you can frame it in terms of talking about energy and energy policy. The way, for example, that Cylinder failed in part because of China investing more in their R&D for renewables and new energy sources, making it a competitiveness issue. Talking about a lot of related things because, unfortunately, as soon as you start on global warming, it's all of a sudden one or the other.
I think that seeing the scientists, though, on television, as you say, on the Johnny Carson show back in the day, that made science suddenly accessible. It made it for everybody suddenly to engage in and embrace.
And if you want to talk about impact, I mean, how many young scientists did Carl Sagan motivate through Cosmos and his books and his films?
But Sagan was unusually talented as a communicator.
Right.
And as we know, he did suffer professionally because of it. I don't think that would happen today. I mean, the gentleman who got to the mic threw out this big bouillabaisse of issues, and not all of them are connected. I don't think Jim Watson's problems with his colleagues are just due to his being in the paper a lot. But those of you who work in a culture that isn't supportive of communication need to speak up for those who do. When somebody says about a colleague, oh, he's on TV so much, or she's on TV so much, you need to say, that's great.
Yeah.
They're getting the message out.
Good for you.
The other thing I would throw out there is, first of all, Dave works at the Bird Alzheimer's Center, which is, we talk to them a lot because, as you can imagine, Alzheimer's is a huge issue in this demographic. So we do work with them a lot. As journalists, what's really, really helpful to us from researchers is help with context. It can be very, very difficult for someone who's not an expert, and this needs to be communicated more clearly to readers, not only just how important a certain finding is, but when we're talking about statistics and this drug has a 50% improvement, is that relative? Is that absolute? That all needs to be explained. How does this particular finding compare with others? Is this one? Is this just like 16 other things that finally got debunked? That really needs to be broken down so people can understand that. I understand what Dave was saying about we in the media have a tendency, we have to tell both sides of the story. Well, sometimes one side of it is garbage. And if we better understand context, we can ferret through that. I mean, one of the things we've been doing at the St. Petersburg Times for the last few years is politifact.com, our website. And one of the things that's empowered all journalists in the newspaper to do is to recognize when the second side is garbage. And no, we don't have to give them equal time just because one nutbag says that there's no such thing as climate change. And I hope that that's changing. I hope we're getting smarter. But also, when we write about you and something didn't come out right, call me. I mean, I never hear from anyone who says, your reporter got this wrong, unless it's like screamingly wrong.
Right.
And you shouldn't hesitate. We're not going to blacklist you. I mean, I want to know that stuff. So, don't feel like you can't say anything.
Go ahead.
I'd like to add that I think it would be really helpful for the University of South Florida to give a course something like the one I give at Columbia. Because I have my students who are PhDs and researchers write op-ed pieces, write book reviews, write profiles, and actually do journalism, some of which gets published. But actually seeing what the process is like, doing it themselves, really gives them insight in how to do it. And I'm sure you could find a wonderful person from the St. Petersburg Times to teach it and walk in their shoes a bit.
We have people from USF and medical doctors, therapists. A lot of people in this community have been writing columns for the St. Petersburg Times. And it's been a lot of fun for me working with them. And I think they've gotten a lot out of it too. And talk about, Mary was making her presentation about, credible sources. I think people like reading a story about prostate cancer written by a neurologist.
Op-ed sections are wide open and want your contributions. You can speak in your own voices if you speak coherently.
That's right. Simplify. Simplify.
Honestly, beyond writing, I make my students role play. So they not only have to do, usually they have to do an assignment that's writing for their peers and writing for a non-academic audience, but they have to talk to me, and I'll interview them either as like Jon Stewart about whatever their topic is, or as a chief of staff, and they have to get their message across quickly, efficiently, and make me care. And I mean, I think as much as writing, it's that public speaking, that communicating that really makes a difference
Great
too.
idea. Go ahead with your question, please.
Hi, my name is Ryan Morris. I'm a graduate student in the Mass Communications department, and I also work in the College of Public Health, working with children's health issues and access to health insurance. My question, I don't recall who said it, but said that students weren't able to make a living as science writers.
Claudia was talking about publishing your work. You may not make a living at it, but
Was that publishing in what format? So,
on the web, wasn't it?
Well, the value of writing in general has dropped, thanks to the Huffington Post and others, to almost nothing. So it's very hard for a journalist to make a living, let's say, as a freelance writer.
no, I completely agree. However, I think it's a sad fact that so many of the major media publications have relied on its good enough content, and we don't see that on the science side. Sadly, if we do, there are serious ramifications. And I would like to see more universities and more departments focus on science writing, yes, but also focus on the content that's being created, that it is not given into, let's just get it out there, and information isn't free. It comes from somewhere, it comes from a human being, it has to make a living, it has to eat. So I'm curious to know what you promote in your program at Columbia to encourage the students to be savvy writers as well as savvy business people to work with writers and publications to make sure they, if they are talented and have that ability to write well and communicate these matters that change lives and save lives, what you may promote and what you could recommend other educators in order to do.
It's a good question. I don't have a master plan for this economy and the changes in technology, but what I say to my students is that we've always lived in a system that has a lot of cracks within it, a lot of ways around the system, and I'm going to help you get a voice so that you can find one of those cracks and open the door and be heard. I don't know. I can't give you a roadmap because I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there are very few people who do. I'm just curious if you had any, and I'm not trying to dig in here, but I was wondering if you had come across any resources or interesting anecdotes that come through of writers who have stuck to doing what they do best and working through a system.
Sheril.
Yeah.
Sheril is a very good example. Sheril created an amazing career for herself that she completely invented. It did not exist before Sheril.
That's great.
Rebecca Sloot,
That's another example. She's a genius, and it's a good book.
How are we doing on time? Are we still okay to take more questions? This gentleman's been waiting. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Mason. I'm professor of environmental and occupational health in our College of Public Health. And in our arena, obviously, much of what we do has to be communicated and communicated very clearly to, quite frankly, a very angry public. And what I'm really interested in hearing from you guys, because we teach it. We do it in every class that we teach. We teach them how to communicate quickly. Irene worked with us hand in glove some years ago when she basically was in our face and basically said, how do you flip around the way you normally present? How do you learn to lead with the most important point, which is not the way we are trained in science? So what I'm really interested in hearing from you guys is the timing of courses and the very real need for those courses to be, and this is not just wordsmithing, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and collaborative. It's not one discipline, it's multiple disciplines. Public health is not a solo practice. I'll be very parochial. We cannot do what we do without your assistance and without the assistance of all the sister disciplines. And so I would like to know, where do we start? Would that we could go back to the 1970s when I was at the National Cancer Institute as an intramural scientist, where we worked with the best science writers in the world and sat with them for months, working on ways in which to craft. We have become such an impatient society. Gone are the days. But we've got to get back to that shared, if you will, trust and intersection in order to communicate effectively and in a timely way. Unfortunately, we put too much emphasis on time as opposed to effect.
Right, deadlines come up and we have to make them. Anybody have any?
Well, I mean, and the deadlines are just become tighter and
Absolutely, and there are more of them.
The internet, 24-hour news cycle and television, Twitter, you know, if you don't get the message out at 10 a.m. this morning, well, now it's too late, you know.
But I'm really interested in this training. If we're going to teach the next generation, you know, some of us might retire in the next decade. Hello. And it might be really nice if we could infect that next generation, at least with a commitment to the importance. Where do you start? When do you start and how do you do it? Because you need redundancy. One class doesn't do it.
This is, sorry. Well, this is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. I mean, especially being now working in energy. I'm in an engineering department, but I'm often working with people in the geosciences, in departments that are scattered all across campus, when really we're after the same goal. So in a piece I had earlier this month in Nature, just a letter, I wrote with my co-author about finding ways to create new centers, like energy departments on campus. I mean, of course, that's not part of the traditional way we do things, but the nation and the world are changing in such a manner where we'll have to start building these bridges. These C.P. Snow talks about two cultures, but these bridges just where things aren't segregated as departments. And I know it would take a sea change to make that happen on campuses, but you guys are University of South Florida, you can start here.
Well, you are doing it.
Good.
Well, I mean, one thing I would like to add to that, I don't know how you formalize it, but one of the things that's really opened up my mind is for the last over a year, I've been taking classes at the University of South Florida College of Public Health. I'm working on a master's degree. And every time I go to a class, I get a story idea. I mean, the other day I'm in my health economics class, and we're talking about the economics of trauma centers. It's a very big issue in Florida now. We've got the HCA chain wanting to get into the trauma business, and there are some really very serious economic issues in addition to the healthcare issues. Now, how do you I mean, I'm a health editor and I'm taking classes. I don't know how you formalize that, but what it tells me is that we have to find ways, as you were saying, Sheril, to build those bridges and to get over them and kind of, get out of our bunkers a little bit more. And, just try to find ways to make our paths cross more often.
Go ahead.
Hi there. My name is Lainey Coyne. I work for the Preeclampsia Foundation. And as a nonprofit organization, we serve an interesting role in providing evidence-based knowledge translation for not just the public, but also in many cases the media. So being that catalyst for allowing the media to better understand the causes of the research. What do you guys feel, I would just like to hear some thoughts about the sort of synergy between third-party knowledge translator, whether nonprofit organizations, alliances, or other organizations that also serve to help branch between media and the researchers.
I think they can be, you mean groups like yours, the American Heart Association, the Cancer Society, and groups like that, how they can help?
Exactly.
Anyone want to take that? I think they have big public affairs and media relations groups within their groups, and they can help boil down messages and make them palatable to the general public. That's one thing that I would say. Anybody else?
I think they could produce fewer press releases, and it would be a great public service.
That'd be a big help.
Yeah, and for starters, anyone who is on a phase 1 trial, don't send out a press release on it. We're not going to cover it.
Right, sending it out too early is a mistake. I agree. Yep. Does that help at all?
It does.
Thank you.
Oh, let me say, don't not be heard from, but really only be heard from when it's genuinely news.
I think one of the interesting things about what's changing in the way people gather information now with the internet, and it's a blessing and a curse because I think as Claudia was saying earlier, it's this, a URL is a URL, whether it's the New York Times or who knows what, but it means that a university with a large press office or a foundation with the resources can get its message out in very well-written, well-presented, well-laid out newsletters or online things, which is great. And so you don't actually, I hesitate to say this, but you don't need us on the one hand. Of course, the concern on the other is that those types of stories tend to be one-sided for good measure. If you're the University of Southern Florida, you want to promote the University of Southern Florida, or if you're your foundation, then you've got your disease to focus on.
So maybe perceived bias.
Right. So, so it's not that it's not that it's bad, but it's just that it's, the journalistic exercise tries to get, more well-rounded, get viewpoints on both sides where it is needed. And so there is that concern that, people might be getting biased information from less credible sources, of course, than these organizations. But I think as Claudia was alluding to, in that relationship, you don't want to burn your bridges, but you sometimes where, it's, if you can start to gauge where you get pickup, and you can think, you know what, I don't want to kind of clutter people's inboxes with this one, but it might be important to that small community. You can still do that.
You can target the audience
Yeah.
that receives your information, and it's probably a good idea.
So then, just as a short rebuttal, what is the sort of the increased credibility that you would see from an outside organization, not the ones conducting the research, that would make you, sort of seek them out as a knowledge source?
Probably because we get a lot of information from certain groups and we can rely on them not to bring us information too early. I think we get to know which ones we'll look at and which ones we just delete without, even opening the email. That's what I do. Okay, sure. Do we have time for one more question? Okay, go right ahead, please.
Yes, Kevin Speed, Dean of our College of Pharmacy. I want to flip this around just a moment. We've had a very good discussion. I think Sheril, you had a very provocative statement earlier about the bad guns. I perceive that there's a lack of a willingness of the media to take on policymakers. Do you all perceive that, number one, it's happening, and number two, do you feel that if you did that, you would be a peril?
You think we don't take on policymakers?
Yeah, well, for example, when you talk about global warming, and a policymaker will come out and say, I think that's ridiculous. And you've clearly possibly been with a researcher, and you know that very good science is going into that. Will the media take on that individual and take on policymakers in terms of really saying, no, you're wrong, and here's why you're wrong?
Oh, yes.
I don't feel like I see enough of that anymore. I feel like the bully pulpit of the policymaker is overwhelming to the point where very good science is not getting out there. I watched one of Dr. Morgan's scientists attacked in a public forum by a politician. If we're talking about caffeine being a possible treatment and cure for Alzheimer's, and he was attacked. It was really funny to watch a politician that clearly had no scientific background lecturing to the scientists who were doing the research as a career. And there were media people there, but nobody the following day or the following week took on that individual.
No one wrote about it, but they were in the room at the
They
time.
were in the room. I was sitting right behind. They came to interview me afterwards. So I just want to see, do you all see peril for yourself if you go out there and really begin to take on policymakers in that regard?
Go ahead, Sheril.
So I don't, but I regularly do take on policymakers on all of these issues. I remember being in a hearing on climate change in 2006 when a particular senator started talking about when man hunted the dinosaurs. And you just saw his staffers behind him like, oh, did he really just say that? And he's a charming man, but no, I think it's our, well, I'm not going to say everyone. I feel like it's my responsibility. The reason I do this is because I want to see better science policy enacted. And I think we're suffering globally because no one gets it. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity just to bring up science debate. Has anyone here heard of science debate? Because we're ramping back up. Oh, look, Mary has. Research America partnered with us. Science Debate was founded by people in the media, by some journalists, some people who are two screenwriters, Matthew Chapman and Sean Lawrence Otto. Sean has a new book out, Fool Me Twice, but he was the screenwriter for House of Sand and Fog. And Matthew Chapman wrote Runaway Jury. Lawrence Krauss, an astrophysicist. Chris Mooney, a journalist. Me, whatever you want to call me. Austin Dacey, a philosopher. So a very hodgepodge group of people who said, look, science is being abused in policy. We want to do something about it. So we simply put out a call for people to say, I'd like to see a debate on science and technology issues, not a pop quiz, but a forum to talk about where the candidates, this was 2007, 2008, where the candidates stand on these very significant issues in human health and oceans and energy and climate. And within a few weeks, we had about 40,000 people sign on. We had Congressman Vern Ehlers and Rush Holt, a Democrat and a Republican, two physicists in Congress, support us as co-chairs, and nearly the entire scientific establishment came on board to support this, but also Nobel laureates, university presidents, a lot of people in the media, and it was a very, very simple ask. And while we didn't see a televised debate, we did have both major candidates, Obama and McCain, answer 14 questions that we put forth to them, and that really helped set the basis for Obama's policies coming in on science. And he surrounded himself with some of our biggest supporters, like Stephen Chu, John Holdren, and Jay Levchenko in cabinet positions. And so I understand what you're saying, and I completely agree that a lot of people aren't willing to make those challenges, but perhaps more of us are and want to continue to see that grow in the future.
Yeah.
I think you also,
No, go ahead.
I think you also need to consider context. I'm familiar with the study about caffeine, specifically caffeinated coffee, that the Bird Alzheimer's Center has been working on, and we actually wrote a story about that, just reporting on the research. I wish I knew what the context was and who the politician was and why on earth he or she would find it appropriate to attack a scientist. It's also, without knowing more about that, I can't really address that instance, but one that I'll take up, Pinellas County, which is the county where St. Petersburg is located, now has the not very proud distinction of being the largest county in the United States that is going back to taking the fluoride supplementation out of the water, because we have a lot of people apparently with tinfoil hats who worry about these things. And it was a huge issue. I mean, we had policymakers, as you're saying, getting up and spouting garbage science. It's not even science, it's just garbage. And it was a huge uproar. Our website blew up. We had reporters who could not function for days because their phones wouldn't stop ringing. So, I mean, I totally know what you mean about the blowback when you've got a policymaker who comes up with something that scientifically is nuts, but for whatever reason is very popular. Again, if anybody sees anything like that, call me instantly, please. I want to know about that. I am horrified to think that somebody was getting attacked for their science and nothing was being said about it.
Is it true, as I've heard, maybe Sheril, you would know, that there's a question on the ballot in Mississippi as to when life begins? If it's true, that's a scientific question that's up for a vote.
And the voters are going to decide.
Right.
That's a moral question too. But I take exception that the media never does that. I'll just, the case of Michelle Bachmann with the HPV vaccine.
Yeah.
I mean, her statements on that kind of sunk her, well, other things might have sunk her campaign, but it was, she said that, and the next day she was down in the polls and hasn't dug herself out. So I think there's only so much you can say, science is real, climate change is real, whatever. There's just a pervasive anti-intellectualism often that was shown in various statistics about how much scientists are trusted, and that whole exercise of, scientists are just part of this group that just wants to get more money. I mean, you can't fight that with saying that in these individual instances this the policymakers are
Just real quickly then, we're out of time.
What Mary showed us, and all of us, is this is what we've got. You can't call it anti-intellectual, you can't put names on it. This is what we have right now. What are you going to do about it? Because it's where you live and how you make your living.
Good, well said. Well, I think that's all the time that we have for this particular panel. Thank you all very much.